Okay, welcome back to part 2 of this tutorial where we left off last time. We just uploaded all the files to the assistant, to the vector store. For now, we can move over to wiring up the front end a little bit, the UI, so that we can actually start to talk to our assistant. We'll want an input box and we'll want basically output. So what we could do is we could make this, let's try making this a row. And on the left side, we'll have our input box. We'll have a button here to send message. And then we'll have our display of what's coming back from the assistants over here. So for that, we'll set up a repeating group. We'll put it over here, and the data source here will be text. And we'll set it to our assistants containers thread messages. And so now we'll get into talking about threads and messages. We haven't talked about this yet. So the way that your conversations are handled with assistants is through threads. So if you come to the documentation, there's stuff about threads in here. So in this quick start with assistants, you've got step 4 is create a thread. So basically a thread is a body of messages that have been generated from runs. So you create a thread, like in this case here, they're passing in a file and a purpose. You don't have to pass in files, but here we're going to create a thread that has these messages. And if you've looked at the API for chat completion, it's fairly similar. So you've got a role and content, and then you've got some attachments, which is new or different from chat completions. But we're not going to do this. We're going to use a vector store on the assistant rather than here. Note here that it says vector store is created using message attachments, which is this here. We're attaching a file directly to a message. They have a default expiration policy of 7 days after they were last used. And then here we have some code about how to run this with streaming. But in any case, what we want to do is set up now a workflow that will create a thread. We want basically to do two different things. We want to be able to create a new thread. We want to be able to continue a thread. And so I guess we need three things. We need to be able to reload an old thread. So the first thing we'll do is look at setting up a thread with an initial input, and then after that, what we need to do to keep that thread going. So that's what we'll do next. Okay, so the first thing we want to do, we've got this button here called create. I'm just going to rename this create thread and run. I'm going to make this a column container just for now. And then I want another button that instead of create thread and run, we want to add a message to the history. Or sorry, we want to add a message to the thread, and then we'll have another button to trigger a run. So this one will say add, oh, and as a funny sort of side note, it looks like Bubble has changed the UI for the design tab since yesterday, I think. So now we have different button types here. Hadn't seen this before. Anyway, the label here will say add message to thread, and then we'll need another button that says create run. These two bits of functionality will wire up in a minute. First, I want to look at getting data back from the assistant with the files that we've uploaded, just to make sure that that's working. So I have a sample prompt here that I want to use. It says what research is currently being done on LLM user modeling in Canada. And then when providing references, please include the file path and ID. And you'll see why I have this in a second. So we'll reload this page. We'll stick the prompt in here. And when we create the thread and run it, we will get some output with these annotations for sources. So we can see here, this spits out, and we get this kind of thing here, 417, and then the source. Now, this isn't super useful. So one thing we'll be looking at later is how to replace this with a link to a file or maybe a chunk of text that this is being pulled from. But for now, we're going to leave this alone. I looked at this yesterday. This might be a function of the plugin. It might be something you do on the front end of your Bubble app. But in any case, this is what I was talking about. This is the file path. It's basically the PDF that we uploaded to the assistant. And here's the file ID. Now, this might be a spurious ID because the file IDs are actually file dash something. So I'll come back to my vector store and see if it's in here. I don't know if there's a search function actually for files. I haven't checked this yet. They don't list the file ID here, they list the title. So we can search for the title of the PDF, which is this. It doesn't show up yet, but most of our PDFs aren't loaded yet. Ah, there it is. So here's the file. So that's good. At least we know that this file ID, YWPRI. So this is correct. So that's good. So we know it's actually referencing the file. I wonder I'm going to check what's in this document. So here's our list of PDFs. We can search for that file name here. And here it is. And what does it say? User modeling, current research, and future directions. So this is the survey paper. So, I mean, I guess that's a good place to start if you want an overview of this kind of thing. In any case, this isn't quite, I would rather see each of these have sort of more targeted references. But yeah, it says for more comprehensive details. I'd rather have like each of these linked to PDFs from different labs and some context and stuff, but you can get that by playing with the prompt. What I'm going to try to do now is wire up these other two buttons so that we can continue, like we maybe dig into one of these points or something. Right now we don't have that wired up, so let's do that. So we'll come back to our workflows, which are here. We have this create thread and run, but we don't have this workflow. So we'll start on this one. So we would say create message here. So we'll create a message. We're going to need the thread ID, which we set here, some content for a message, and then the rest we can basically leave alone unless you want to attach a file or what have you. But for now, we can just take the value of that input. So right now we're calling it create thread and run, but we should probably just call it assistant input or something. So we'll do that. So that'll be the content, and then the thread ID. In order to use the thread that we're currently running, what we could do is we could reference the current thread ID on the container because we know that we're just dealing with one thread at a time. But that's not the most robust way. Like, for example, let's say you want to store different threads that your assistant has access to, and we probably will set this up sort of in the next pass through this UI. Like right now, it's just a mess of everything, right? But once we want to be able to have multiple assistants and then multiple threads that we've stored in our database, we're going to need some way of sort of loading that thread. So what I'll do instead is here, when we execute this action, we could set the current thread ID on a page element, like a custom state on the page or somewhere here. So let's do that. So we're creating a new thread in the database. So that's good. But what we could do is say set state of an element. And on the page, we could say create a new custom state called current thread or latest thread maybe. And it'll just be text, and we should probably say thread ID actually. So it'll be a text, and it could be the result of step 2's thread ID, but this is just referencing the new thread ID in the container, which is the same thing. So once we do that, then we can say when we're creating a new message, we can say that the thread we want is this one here, the latest thread ID, and then that message. And so what that'll do is it'll go to the API and create a message that's attached to that thread. It won't update the data container, and it won't execute the run. So we're going to have to do a couple of other things there. So I'm going to rename these buttons actually. I'm going to call this create message and then create run. So let's add a workflow to create run now. So we have create run. We have create run non-streaming or create run streaming here. So here, if we pass the thread ID and the assistant ID here, it should execute our run. But I think what we'll see is we'll get our response back, but we won't see our inputted message. So I think we actually have to modify something in the plugin to allow us to do this. So I guess we'll figure this out as we go. So let's put our thread in here. Our assistant ID, we're just going to copy for now. This should be dynamic as well, like on the page, the current assistant or something. Model, we can leave all this blank because this just overrides the defaults for the assistant and the thread and stuff. Down here we have our OpenAI key. We're going to put that in here as well. And now let's test what happens when we try to execute these other two steps. So we'll paste this in here, create thread and run. And then we've got a file here, right? So what we could do is we could say, can you expand more on this file? I don't know if the Assistants API under the hood can be instructed to grab a file based on the file API's identifier, but we're going to try that. So in here, let's say provide an abstract of this file. So just a summary of this. It says in the limitations in the documentation that summarization is not well supported right now, but just for testing. So let's say create message. So we get an error from the API. It might be this colon here messing up the fields. So I'll try this again. Okay, so I skipped over a couple of things trying to debug. Number one, in this workflow where we're creating a run and we're referencing this thread ID that's set on the page, which is being set from this action. We're saying set this custom state based on the new thread ID of the container. This doesn't actually work because the way that Bubble plugins work is they try to parallelize actions, run different things at the same time if they can. And this will start running, and this will start running shortly after, before this action actually sets the thread ID sometimes. So it's kind of clunky, but what I've done here is there's a trigger in the plugin that says when a thread is created. So when we execute certain actions that create threads, like create thread and run or just create thread, we will set that value on the container, that new thread ID. So that's what this is here. So instead of setting it here, create thread and run, we can get rid of this action or this step and have it set here. And so this will handle one of the bugs I was encountering. The other bug is when we create a message, it was erroring out because this message, the content field, it needs to have quotes around it. So I've updated the description of this action in the plugin. I'll push a new version in a minute that includes this in the documentation. But the reason for this needing, it's not the best user experience, I will admit, but you need the quotes in there to resolve it as a string. Instead of just putting them in automatically for you with the plugin, the reason it doesn't do that is because you can send it an array. So you can have a more complicated message structure in square brackets that has like attachments and things. And so in order to maintain flexibility, I haven't added the quotes automatically, but I've added them here. And so this we can now run. We'll update this page. If we now run these two different workflows in sequence, so I'll just say, tell me a joke. And then this one will fire, and you can see it creates this thread. And so that's the thread ID for when we click create message. And so if we run this workflow in step by step, we can see here's that same thread ID on the page. And here's the quote wrapped text. So that all works fine. But the problem that we're facing here is that when we run this, it will add the message to the thread through the API, but the on-page display for the assistance container doesn't know that that message has been added. So basically we need to create a new action in the plugin that will allow us to both create this message in the thread on OpenAI's platform, but also update our assistance container so that it reflects the messages there. So we have a couple of options for doing that. We can have another action that says add message to thread, and then that would focus just on updating the data container, and that would separate the two steps of creating it on the back end and also adding it to the front end. Those would be two different things. We could combine the two actions so that whenever you run create message, it updates the assistance container. But that doesn't really work actually, because you might want to be adding messages to different threads that aren't on the page. So I don't love that solution. But then a third option would be to retrieve all of the thread from OpenAI and then set its contents into the assistance container so that it's displayed on the front end. So we currently have an action to pull down the thread from the API, but we don't have a way of setting it on the container, which is the thing that handles the display. So I think we're going to build two new actions in the plugin right now as part of this sort of live build demo. The first one I'll build is we will add a single message to the container so that when we click this button, let's say, it will pop it into the list of messages that the container is holding. And that will sort of auto update on the front end And then when we send it over, it will be in the list of the assistant's messages. And then we'll build a second action, which will set a list of thread messages that come back from the API into the container. So we don't currently have a way to load a thread into the container. So that's what we'll do second. And then you have two different options for how to update your container, with the first one being sort of on the fly in flow, and the second one being if you want to reload later, it would be a better option. Although it would also work if you wanted to run that retrieval every time you send a message or create a new message. It's kind of wasteful to fetch all that data every single time. So we'll do the add message action first, and we'll do the retrieve thread action or load thread action second. So if we come into the plugin editor for LLM Toolkit, we have a couple of actions here: create thread and create run. What we're going to do first is create an action in here, and we're going to call it add message to container, maybe add message to assistance container. And we'll copy this documentation. We'll say use this action to add a new user message to an assistant container. For this field, if we open up, say, this one, we can see that this create run action has a thread ID, an assistant ID, model version, so on and so forth. These are the different parameters that that action takes. In this case, the simplest way to do this would be to just have a prompt or a content field and add that and handle the rest of it for the user, because all of the interaction here is going to be on the front end. It's just a state in the plugin, and we can probably just have a single input field to start. So let's say content, and it will be a dynamic value so that we can pull it from wherever, like an input box or something of type text. Caption can be content or message. We could say long text, probably best. And then documentation, say, enter your message here. It can't be optional if we want to add a message, I don't think. The action won't do anything otherwise, so we'll make it mandatory. So then what we want to do, if we come down here, we now have this stub for this action. So we want to load any data and do the operation. So we can see here, this is the code for create run, but it's obfuscated for release. So what I'm going to do is grab some code from these functions just for the updating the internal states and paste it in here and then work off of that. So I'm going to grab those bits of code. And so what we want to do here is we have a state on this container, this assistance container, an internal state called instance.data.thread messages. And this is where we're storing the list of messages. And so what we want to do here basically is add the message that the user has stuck into this input box content up above. So what we can do here is use the push method from JavaScript to just add this additional message to the end of the list. And we'll get it by referencing properties.content. Now, this will update the state internally, but it doesn't change things for the user, like on the front end. So in order to actually update the container, we have to run an action called instance.publishState. And this is a built-in method that will basically surface internal data to the browser or to the user. And so the state that we want to publish is called thread messages. And the content that we want to push is thread messages. So there's an external state called thread messages and then an internal one called thread messages, and we're just sort of syncing them here. If this is confusing, feel free to check out some of our other plugin tutorials. We've also got a course about to be released on building plugins like this with streaming interfaces. So if you want to learn more about this, feel free to check that out on the Launchable Academy. Okay, so we're going to test this now. If it's this simple, that's great. We'll have a simple mechanism whereby we can add a new message to the container, and then when we create our run, it will get compiled for us. That would be great. We'll have to see if this works. And in order to do that, I'm going to open the dev app again. And I'm actually going to port this page, this Assistant Scratchpad, from the demo app to the development app because in the dev app, the plugin is in testing mode. So anytime I change the code for the plugin, it gets updated in the app. So I'll copy to another app and I'll paste it in here. Okay, and so now this is the same page, but replicated in our development app. So now I'm going to create another button here, and wire it up with the action that we just added to the plugin. So we will call this add message to container. And then in here, we can look for that action. Actually, in order for this to show up in this editor, we're going to have to refresh the page because the action is new. And before I do that, actually, I will change the name of the action here because I think if we just say add message to container, it will be clear enough because assistance container will be part of the action name, just the way that Bubble constructs these things. So if we reload now, we should be able to have an action that says add message to container. And we can put whatever we want. We say the input box is value. And then we'll test and see whether everything is working together. And that will be the first option for proceeding. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can go in here and say add message to container. And so this is that action we just created, add message to container. Here's the assistance container. And the content of the message will be whatever our input is. And now we'll test this and see if this works. We can now test that action. So we say, tell me a joke, create thread and run. So here's our new thread. And we'll get our response back. That's all good. And now we could say, tell me another in French and say add message to container. And you can see it pops up here. So now the test will be if we run create run now, if we run this action, whether all of these messages will get picked up and sent over. So let's wire that up and see if we can get that to work. So if we come back to our editor, this create run button doesn't have a workflow yet. So we want to do create run streaming. So that's this one. The thread ID will be the container's new thread ID. The assistant ID will be the same thing that we've pasted in here. So we'll paste that in there. Model can be left empty. We don't need to override any of this. And then for the OpenAI key, we'll just paste it in here again. We'll take this and paste it here. Okay, so now we can say, tell me a joke. So we can create a thread here and run it. Here's our thread ID. And here's our response. Now we could say, tell me another in French. And we could say add message to container, and there it pops up down here. So that's good. It appears on the front end. But OpenAI doesn't know anything about this. This message does not yet exist in the thread on the OpenAI backend. So what we would have to do is also create a message, which is identical, using the API call. So what we can do is in the action where we say add message to container, which is this one, we can also run the create message API call. And so what we would do here is in quotes, again, as before, we would put whatever the message is that we just added to the container. So it would be exactly the same. This content field would be exactly the same as this, except wrapped in quotes. Everything else can stay the same. This thread ID should be the assistant container's new thread ID. Okay, so now that we've wired up both the adding the message to the container on the front end and then creating it through the API, sort of in the back end on the OpenAI system, now we can come back to our app. We can say, tell me a joke. We'll create our thread in our first run. Here's our thread ID. And then we can say, tell me another in French. We can add that message to the container. And also in the background, we're adding it to the thread through the API. And now we can create another run, and it should execute and come back with a joke in French. So this is working. So this pattern of usage where we add messages through this, this front end action, and then also mirror that in the back end, this is working. So that's great. So I'll push this update now. The next thing I'll do is create an action to pull the thread down from OpenAI and load it into the data container so that you can, as long as you have the thread ID, you can always reload it from OpenAI. So let's do that next. So we currently have this list messages action, and this is already in the plugin. So here's our thread that we just created. So I just plugged it in here, just pulling it out of the app. So if we inspect our development app, here's the new thread ID that we just created for this. And if we come over here, and click reinitialize, we will get all the messages from that thread. It's not obvious in here, but if you click show raw data, here's the data array with all of the different messages inside. So each one has a content and then a text field. There's attachments and metadata for each message as well, depending. So the messages are actually, there's lots of different stuff that you might want to track or use. Like for example, maybe you need to link messages by metadata or something. But what I'm going to do for now is just handling the message retrieval and setting for the assistance container. So what we'll do is we'll take this kind of input, so this kind of return value, and have the action in the plugin that says take this, the output from list messages, and load the messages into the container so that we can execute a new run. And so we actually already have code to do that in other spots. So I'm just going to grab that and port it over to a new action. So we'll come back to our elements and our assistant container, and we will create a new action here. I think we'll call it load assistant thread messages. So in the plugin, there's now an action called load assistant thread messages. And so the idea here is if you created a thread and run it before and you want to retrieve it, now we have an action that we can load it back into the assistant container. So I'll quickly do a demo of this and show you the workflow. So if we say here, tell me a joke, and we create thread and run like before, we show it here, here's our thread ID, here's a joke. So now what we could do is we could say, tell me another in French, and say add message to container. And so that happens. If you saw the blue bar shoot across there, that's the action adding it to the API as well, which we covered. And so now this thread ID here, we'll stick our newest thread in here and we'll say create run. And we can see it updates. Now it's moving on to the next sort of iteration of this conversation. So that's all good. We've got these 4 messages in our list of messages from this run now, or these 2 runs. And so we have this thread ID. So if we wanted to come back later and resume it, we can use this new action. So this is called load messages, load assistant thread messages. And it takes 2 values, either message as list or messages as JSON. In this workflow, load messages list, we are pulling it from the API using this list messages action from the plugin. So when we click that button, we'll go and we'll feed the thread ID here in this action. And we'll go to the API and pull down all the messages that we have in that thread. And then we'll load them into the assistant container by saying, take the result of this action. And we say, so the result of step 1's data. And then we take each item's content and its text value. So what this returns, I'll show you in the step-by-step in a second, is just the text from each message in that thread. And what this will do is it'll parse it and load it into the data container, and then we can resume the run if we want to. So we don't have anything here right now. If we paste our thread ID here and click this load messages list, here's the API call. So here's our thread ID from here. And what it's going to send back is, so result of step 1 is a big API call response. We're going to pull out the data, which is this, and that's a list of messages. And we're going to take each item's content, where the content is, it's like a small JavaScript object that has a type field and a text field. And so the text value is the actual message that we'll see here. And so we can see here's that French joke. And so that's what the text value is resolved to, is just these plain text objects. So we click run next and we see it loads into here. That's great. And so now if we wanted to continue the run, we could say, tell me one in Spanish. We could say add message to container. And we ran into a bug actually. This workflow, add message to container, is currently reading from that state on the page, that custom state. But this is a bit of a problem if there's a mismatch between having created a thread and then reloaded a different one. So this workflow just has a bug in it. So if we go into this workflow, when we create the message through the API, what we'll do instead of reading it off the page is we'll read it from that input. So the same input that we're using to fetch the thread, which is this one here, we'll also use that to figure out which thread to add our new message to. So let's just go through that again real quick. I'll just fetch down that old thread and we'll add a new message to it. So it's kind of a nice illustration, hopefully. So here's our thread ID. We want to load the messages into our container. So there they are. And now we want to add another one, say, tell me one in Spanish. They add message to container, and it's here on the front end, hopefully on the back end as well. And now we click create run, and hopefully we will get a joke in Spanish. There we go. So now we have the ability to add new messages to the container to continue the run, as well as to retrieve threads we've already executed runs on and resume them. So this makes this a lot more usable. So I'm going to pause this part of the tutorial for now, and we might get into styling in the next part so that we can start to look at multiple assistants, multiple threads, and that sort of thing. But anyway, the basic functionality of multi-turn conversations has been built out. So I'm going to mark this as the end of part 1 of this deep dive, and we'll see where we go in the next part.